Hello and welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we've got Rebecca Roache with us and she's going to be talking about swearing. I tried to find a good swear word to include in this opening introduction, but I couldn't find one. So I'm going to leave all the swearing to Rebecca and Travis. Rebecca, please go ahead if you have an opening thought experiment.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you about what got me into this topic, like what was the hook for me, and I talk about this in the book as well. So it was some thought about how asterisks work when we see swear words in print, but they're censored, so some of the letters are replaced by asterisks. Um, there was a news story about something that happened in 2014, which was that two computer scientists in the US had a paper accepted to a not entirely reputable journal called the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology. So the way these things work, you get these journals with kind of serious sounding titles, but basically what they do is they accept papers for publication from academics in exchange for a fee. So they'll basically publish anything as long as you pay them. And they accepted a paper by these computer scientists called David Mazières and Eddie Kohler that was entitled "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List." And it was a paper that these guys used to send. They just used to send it to people as a joke when they got included in people's mailing lists. But the whole thing was just that sentence repeated again and again, and it was formatted like a scientific paper. So it kind of, at a first glance, it looks like it's a proper scientific paper. But yeah, it got accepted by this journal, which reveals that they don't read their submissions very carefully. It never got published because they didn't pay the publication fee. But this made the news, which academic publishing doesn't normally. But yeah, it was reported that this had happened, and that the story that I learned about it from on a news site, I can't remember which one, had the picture illustrating the story was the first page of the article, so you could see countless swear words. But in the headline, the title "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List" appeared, but it was censored. So it appeared as "Get Me Off Your F star 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 ing mailing list." And that got me wondering about, how does this work? That the swear words were there on the page because they appeared in the picture illustrating this. But yeah, they hadn't been written in the headline. So I thought this was interesting and puzzling because it does seem to work. Censoring swear words in this way does seem to work, even when we all know which swear word is being censored. But it also seems like it shouldn't work because it just doesn't seem to make sense. So I started wondering what philosophers had said about this and went down a bit of a wormhole looking. So I was supposed to be doing something else, and nobody had written about it. So I eventually wrote about it. This was my doorway into thinking about swearing philosophically.
So when they censor the words, and then say the book is the best cover that I've seen for any book, and you can see there's an asterisk here, but what the camera I think can't pick up is that there's an outline of a U. It looks like the book does in fact say "for fuck's sake," but let's suppose that the outline of the U is not here and it's just the asterisk. Is that a different word? Intuitively, I would have thought, yeah, it's a different word, but maybe the answer to that is more complicated than I think.
Yeah, I wish I could have discussed the title in the book, but unfortunately, I was very bad at coming up with a title. My editor came up with that title, and it happened long after I'd finished writing. I think that there's various ways that we might try to explain what's going on with the asterisks. One of which, as you say, is that F asterisk CK is a different word to fuck. But I think that doing that leads to some strange results. So because the way we use asterisks is in order to write the word fuck. So if you were quoted as saying fuck you to somebody, and this was in print, and it was printed as F*CKU, you wouldn't have been misquoted. We'd all understand that you were being reported as saying fuck you. So we take that censored version of the word fuck to stand for that word. So I think that they have to be the same word. That's the way we understand them. It's just the same word with one of its letters obscured.
If it is the same word, then why would we have different reactions? So it seems like the function of the asterisked version is quite different from the function of the fully spelled out word. And if you put the U in the word, then polite society says, "Oh, hold on." And if you put an asterisk instead, they're like, "Oh, that's okay." How could it be the same word if they have different functions?
To answer this, we have to take a step back and think about what makes swear words shocking in the first place. Obviously, they're not always shocking, but in cases where they are, which tend to be, sort of polite contexts, my theory is that it's not just the actual word. It's not just that arrangement of letters that makes it into something offensive. If you use a swear word in polite company, if you manage to shock people and even offend them by doing that, I think what's going on is that the people around you know that this is a word that's going to upset them, that they don't want you to say it. And so when you say it in that context, they take this to express your disrespect for them. You don't care about how they feel. That's sort of a very short version of what's going on when swear words manage to cause offense. And I think when we censor them with asterisks, there's a competing message going on. So instead of I don't care how you feel about me using this word, which is what you get with uncensored swear words, there's a message that's something along the lines of I want to report to you accurately what's being said, or I want to express this thought in full, but I'm also aware that my doing so by writing out this word in full is going to upset you, so I'm going to replace some of the letters with asterisks. So it's this kind of like expression of consideration and respect, and I think that's what makes asterisks an effective way of censoring swear words. I think underlining that it only really works if you use it sparingly. If you're a journalist writing a news story, say, and you throw the word fuck or some swear word into every single sentence, but you censor it with asterisks every time, then that's, someone reading that who doesn't want to be reading swear words is going to receive the message that, you're not that serious about how the reader feels about swear words. There has to be this element of, this hurts me more than it hurts you. I'd rather avoid using this word, but I kind of have to. So I think, asterisks only work when they are used in the context of, somebody who is wanting to communicate, but also cares about the feelings of the people they're communicating with.
So if they're the same word and we're using asterisks to communicate respect or lack of respect in various contexts, like this is I think a helpful descriptive account of how we in fact use these terms. And I think there's a further question of whether it's rational for our offense to track whether using an asterisk or not. In one sense, it sort of seems like arbitrary that you're conveying the information with slightly different symbols than you otherwise would. So even though somebody might take offense if you say fuck rather than F asterisk CK, why should we react that way?
That's a very reasonable reaction to have. Like, why? We all know what word it is. Why are we doing this silly dance? Because we all know what word is being communicated. So the thought is, well, why not just write it out in full? Either write it or don't write it. Don't just sort of go halfway. So this was the view of Charlotte Bronte, who said something along these lines in the preface to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. So there is, there's a sense in which it's irrational. It just doesn't seem to make sense. But I think it's a convention. So we use asterisks in this way to mitigate the offense that we give when we're writing certain words. This is a recognized thing we do. It's a convention, and all conventions have some element of arbitrariness, or they sort of seem empty in some way. Like, why do we eat with our fork in our left hand rather than our right hand, for example? There's no kind of deep connection between using a fork and the left hand. It could have been the right hand. It's just that, we kind of settled on one rather than the other. I mean, something that this brings out is the fact that our reactions to swearing aren't about the letters themselves. It's about what we signal to each other when we use the words. And so when we tinker around with how the letters are displayed, then it can seem to be, we're just sort of wondering, well, what difference does that make? And I think, part of the answer is it makes a difference because it's not those letters themselves that are responsible for the reactions that people have to swearing.
So I like Travis's question about why people should be offended in one case and not the other case. But I think there's a sort of a deeper question, which is why people are offended in the first place without the asterisk. Why is it that these words have so much power? Now, I can understand to some degree if someone were to say, fuck you, that seems like you should be offended. But if someone is just describing a state of affairs, maybe something that happened to them that day and they're upset and they say, and then the guy said, fucking this. And so they're expressing, let's say, frustration at a situation that they experienced. It's unclear why others should feel offended by that. Why does the mere inclusion of the word, if it's not aimed as an insult, why should that generate offense?
Yes, as you highlight at the end there, there's two things going on here. There's the question, why is offense a thing that happens when people use these words? And then the other question is sort of, well, should they be offended? Is it justifiable? So just to take the second point first, I think in general, we as cultures view swearing too negatively. I think we read into it levels of disrespect that aren't always, maybe sort of levels of disrespect that are rarely there. And I think so that's the sort of normative part. We produce our offense reaction. There's too many false positives. We're offended more often than we really need to be if we were to reflect on why we're reacting in that way. And I think one thing going on there is that it's not clear to us why we are offended about swearing. If you take something like theft, if you get upset because somebody's stolen something from you, then there's a sort of fairly obvious explanation about why you're upset, that you've been harmed in some way by being stolen from. But with swearing, it's much more difficult, and so we don't really understand why we react in this way to swearing, and so all we're left with then are our reactions. If you are someone that gets shocked when people swear, then that's just how it is. You don't know whether you're being justified or not, really, because you don't know why you're reacting that way in the first place. So I think there's kind of muddy waters around the normative part. But in terms of sort of where they get this power to offend from, so as I say, it's not the words, it's what we signal when we choose to use swear words in polite contexts, which are the contexts where people are likely to be shocked by swearing. And I think what it comes down to is it's not very considerate to do something that people around you don't want you to be doing, unless you have a very good reason for it. So if you are invited for coffee at a friend's house and you bring along your pet tarantula, and that your friend is terrified of spiders, I mean, that's just an inconsiderate thing to do. It's got nothing to do with the spider itself. It's that you're doing something that is going to upset your friend, and presumably there's no good reason for it. You could have left it at home. So I think at the heart of swearing's offensiveness, there is this, doing what other people dislike. And swear words. So if we think about the words that we label swear words, they're all taboo words in some sense. I mean, they're taboo words in two senses, actually. They're taboo words in that we're kind of not supposed to say them in polite context. It's rude to swear, but also what they refer to are, sort of things like lavatorial topics, sex, blasphemy, things that are, even without the words, that are taboo topics. And taboos are things that you don't mention or do in company, right? Especially polite company. So, you don't talk about your toilet habits, you don't talk about your sex life, and so on. These things are all taboo. So, and we all know this. So you start out with these topics that we all know nobody really likes. Nobody's going to be comfortable if we start talking about them. And then you get some words for them that develop into swear words. We can talk more about how that happens. But, at the basis, it's just words that refer to topics that people dislike and that people don't like. So that means that, when you start using them in company, people are thinking, well, you're doing something that is making us uncomfortable, and that's quite disrespectful. And I think there's this sort of, I call it offense escalation in the book, but there's this sort of feedback loop where the more obvious it is to everyone that that the people around you don't want you to be using this word, the more offensive it becomes, because just the more overt your show of disrespect is to them.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about what makes something a swear word. It's interesting that there's almost a verbal, I think, equivalent of using asterisks. So as an undergrad, I did a study abroad and was in Torino, Italy, and my friend had us meet up with a couple of Mormon missionaries that he knew. And they would make up terms that they would use as synonyms for swear, so they found a loophole to avoid swearing, it seems. So rather than fuck, they would say frick. But they'd use it in the exact same way, in the exact same context, and it even has sort of the, very similar sound. One thing to think is like, you just made up a new swear word. But presumably they didn't. Well, I don't know. I should ask you, the expert. Are they making up a new swear word? Did they avoid saying swears? What makes something a swear word?
I mean, I think if you take any taboo, there are more and less polite ways of referring to it. So if you take sex, you can talk about, if you turn up at a formal dinner and talk about fucking, then that is going to be quite offensive. I mean, depends what sort of dinner party it is, I guess. But in many cases, that's going to be offensive. But there's less offensive ways that you can talk about the same thing. I mean, you could talk about, you could just use sort of fairly neutral terms. You could talk about having sex instead of fucking. And then there's sort of euphemistic ways that you could talk about it. You could talk about sleeping with somebody, right? So for any taboo, we have sort of really rude ways of talking about it, and there are neutral ways, and then there's sort of like polite ways of talking about it. And you see that with swearing as well. You can think about that. Those are sort of really rude ways of referring to taboos. I mean, so one way to think about this is if we think about what swear words mean, what the word shit means, for example. There's other words for the same thing that are less offensive. So the word crap means the same thing. But just hearing myself talk, just a stream of I'm really bringing down the tone of philosophy on it.
I'm really offended right now. I just want to get that out there.
Okay. There's shit, which is, I suppose, the rudest word we have in English for that thing. And then there's crap, which is a bit more, a bit milder. And I guess sort of number two or feces would be sort of less rude again. So, and I think this comes back to conventions again. That they're all words for the same thing, and some are ruder than others. But there's no real there's no deep reason why shit is the most offensive word for shit. It's just how it's developed in its use, right? It's just become the word that people most associate with, if it's said in a polite context, sort of disrespectful attitudes. And it's just this kind of, it's kind of a house of cards, right? Because sort of where did those disrespectful attitudes come from? How are they attached to this word in particular? And it's just, I think, the inferences we make about each other, that we all know it's the rudest word because we all know that it's the word that people regard as the rudest. And so when you use it in a polite context, everybody takes you to be sort of more disrespectful than they would take you to be if you had said number two or something like that.
Quick follow-up. That's super interesting. And then it makes me wonder, are there going to be cases where it's borderline or maybe there's no fact of the matter about whether something is a swear word? So taking a certain number of people have to be offended or regard it as rude to constitute a swear. And then there's going to be some things that clearly aren't, some that clearly are. And then maybe there's some like, is crap a swear? Is douchebag a swear? There might be a bunch in that like maybe were at one point, but then ceased to be later, or there's just no fact of the matter.
Yeah. My children have been through these lists with me like, is poo a swear word? Is crap a swear word? I mean, I'm not committed to there being this sort of binary division between swear words and words that aren't swear words. I think we have, some words cause offense when we use them in polite contexts, which itself is sort of what's a polite context. That's not necessarily clear cut either. And some words don't. And then we have some words that are kind of borderline. I mean, I'm okay with that. Which is not to say that I think, the category of swear words is a smaller category than the category of words that are likely to cause offense to people. There's words that aren't swear words that are likely to cause offense. So slurs, for example. But yeah, to just address your question, I think, yeah, we can probably say that there are sort of borderline swear words.
Slurs are interesting because they communicate judgment. So when you slur against, let's say, a racial group, it seems that when you use one of those words, you're implying certain implicit assumptions about that racial group. And it makes sense why people might feel offended about that. But when you use a word that refers to a bodily function or an excretion, it's not clear to me why people should feel offended about that. I know that you've discussed this already, but I just wanted to raise a theory. Maybe it's that when you use a word, you force a listener to conjure an image of the thing you're referring to. And it's disrespectful because they don't want to conjure that image. But now the question I have is it wrong to do that? So you've said that people are offended more often than they should be. But given that they are offended, should we care about the fact that they're offended or whether they should be offended? So in other words, should we care about the fact that now they've got a picture of feces in their head? Or should we say, well, regardless of how you feel about conjuring an image of feces in your head, it's my right to do so. It's my freedom of speech. I can do so. That's what trumps any offense that you might feel. And the normativity involved is I can say whatever I want up to a point, and that point is further than swearing.
Yeah. This is great. So there's a few things in here. The idea that swear words offend by causing the listener to think of something they don't want to be thinking about. So this is something that Steven Pinker has said, that he thinks he talks about swear words capturing the listener's attention and making them think of something unpleasant. I don't find that account particularly convincing for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think that's the way it works. I don't think we are thinking of feces every time someone says like, oh shit, or that we're thinking of sex every time someone says fuck. Sort of often it just, unless they are using the words in a way that makes that obvious, I think sort of often it just stops at, oh, somebody said a rude word. We're not necessarily thinking of the referent each time. And sort of course, swear words are just often used in a way that they don't have any referent at all, right? And then there's also the fact that there's ways that we can cause people to think of something unpleasant without causing them to be offended. So yeah, I talk about this in the book a little bit. If you say to somebody, you should teach your daughter to swim because otherwise she might drown if she falls into a river. And, you've sort of caused the person you're talking to think of their child drowning, right? Which is a really unpleasant thing. But you haven't said anything offensive. I mean, depending on where, if you walk up to them while they're getting married and say this, there's a time and a place, but sort of in and of itself, it's not sort of, it doesn't carry the hallmarks of something offensive that you might say. So yeah, I think that's a little bit of a red herring. So just to address your point about, go back to that idea that I said earlier, that I think people sort of overreact a lot. They're offended too easily. And then there's that question, well, how much should we care about that? So I said that the way that swearing manages to cause offense is because people interpret it, when they're shocked or offended, they interpret it as an expression of disrespect. I think often people are just wrong about that. That there's plenty of times that people swear in polite company without meaning any disrespect. Sometimes it's just a slip of the tongue, or sometimes they've misjudged the norms that apply in that particular situation. They've taken it to be informal and it's not, or something like that. So I think, sometimes we're just wrong, or sometimes even if somebody does is speaking disrespectfully, it might be a sort of a heat of the moment thing. They might just be momentarily annoyed. They don't necessarily have the kind of, a deep-seated lack of respect for the worth of the person they're talking to, which I think would be required in order for it to sort of get into, well, certainly to get into moral territory. But, as I said before, the way that we react to swearing doesn't distinguish between these things, because we don't necessarily realize why we're offended in cases where we are offended. Yeah, that question you asked, should we care? What if people say, let's say people are overreacting to swear words. They shouldn't really. There's no reason to be offended in at least some cases when people swear, but they are, and maybe we should care about that, or maybe we shouldn't. I think in general, if you have a choice of avoiding causing offense or causing offense, then you should try not to cause offense, right? All other things being equal. I think sometimes all other things aren't equal. There's some cases where people take offense at the wrong thing. So if people are offended by homosexuality and you have your same-sex partner with you, I mean, the bigot that you're with might be offended if you show affection to your partner in their company. But, sort of how seriously should we take it? Should you avoid being affectionate to your partner? Well, probably not, because that seems like a sort of a burden that you don't need to be carrying. There's this sort of sense of, well, it's this person's problem. They shouldn't be offended by the things that they're offended by. So I think there's this sort of weighing of interests going on. There's also, so I talk in the book about the word cunt. And how I think it's a difficult case here, because it is clearly very offensive, especially in the US. I think it has slightly different use in the US compared to the UK. Like in the US, it's generally a term that's used insultingly. It's directed at women, as I understand it. In the UK, it's sort of more general purpose. I mean, if anything, maybe if someone were to do a survey, which I'm not aware they have done, I would expect them to probably find that British men get called cunts more often than British women by other British people. Now, I think there's clearly the explanation for why cunt is the most offensive swear word and more offensive than cock, which is, you might think, well, they're equivalent terms. They're both terms for genitals. I think, misogyny has to explain what's going on there, why we react differently to those words. And so there's this question of, well, what should we do about this? Because there's a justice issue there. And you find feminists are quite divided about this. Some think, well, we shouldn't, it's so misogynistic, we just shouldn't use it, which, then kind of risks making it even ruder by, increasing the taboo around using it. And then some people think, well, we should just use it more often. It's kind of exposure therapy. Get people used to it, and then, hopefully it will be on a par with cock. And I think one difficulty here is, so I'm, if anything, more on the side of let's use it more often to reduce the taboo. But there's a difficulty there because people are offended by it without necessarily, being aware of the misogyny that underlies those attitudes. Plenty of feminists are offended by the word, for example, but they themselves are not misogynist. They've just internalized the perception of the word. And I think in that sort of case, it's much more difficult. Do we, if you want to sort of break down the taboo around homosexuality, say, then you can give people more exposure to homosexuality, maybe sort of TV depictions of gay people on TV, things like that. But I think in that case, it's sort of fairly obvious what you're doing. You're not trying to offend anyone. You're just trying to normalize a completely benign part of the world, right? But I think things are different if you think about a swear word. If we're talking about sort of let's use cunt more often to normalize it, it's not obvious what you're doing. People might just interpret you as being really offensive. But I think, to come back to the point of, how much should we care about people's attitudes of offensiveness? I think it really depends. It depends what we're balancing, their sense of sort of comfort alongside, what other interests are in play. But also, why they're being offensive and how they're going to react, how they're going to perceive sort of actions that offend them.
Maybe your distinction between a slur and a swear word explains cunt, the offense behind cunt, and the difficulty in explaining away why it's not a problem. When I was at university, I joined a gay rights organization. It was an LGBTQ organization. We didn't have I's and all the pluses back then. We just had LGBTQ. But yeah, I joined this organization, and when I walked in the room where they were housed, they had painted a wall, very colorful wall, with every slur used against people of LGBTQ persuasion. So there was faggot, there was cunt, there was dyke, there was lots of slurs painted on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being quite taken aback by it. And they were engaged in this project that you talk about of trying to normalize those words. And I found that very interesting because having those words in that context, in that room painted by those people, seemed completely inoffensive and shocking in a good way. But if the very same words were used just outside the doorway of that room, they would have a very, very different meaning. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about this distinction between slurs and swear words and how they generate these very highly context-dependent, legitimate offense-making properties.
I think there's some similarities here, but there are differences too. So cunt, the way that cunt tends to be used in the US is slur-like, more so than in the UK. But it's not quite a slur. One reason is that so slur terms tend to have neutral counterparts. So the N-word means black person. And that's the case for all slur terms. They're derogatory terms for the people that they're targeted at. I mean, cunt's not really like that. It's not. So it's used as a word, as a sort of derogatory term directed at women, at least in the US, but it's not a word for a woman. It's just a rude word. It's just a very rude word. And the reason that's important, I think, is that if you think of the way that reappropriation tends to work, So if you stick with the example of the N-word, sort of obviously it's sort of well known in hip hop culture that has been reappropriated, and it's used in, sort of Black people will use it they'll call each other this word in a sort of positive way, or just as in a sense of camaraderie. But yeah, cunt isn't like that. If we ask, well, what would reappropriation of that word look like? Yeah, for one thing, it's not a word. It's not like we are trying to make it into a neutral term for a woman, because it's not a word for a woman in the first place. Another important difference, I think, is that what tends to happen with the reappropriation of slurs is the aim is to make them into to give them a positive spin, but only among members of that target group. So the N-word has a positive use among Black people, but it's still an offensive word if it's uttered by somebody who's not Black. When we're talking, or at least where I'm talking about the attempt to make cunt less rude, there's not the thought that let's just make it so that women can use it less offensively, but it's still offensive when used by everybody else. I mean, to tackle the sort of misogyny underlying it, you would need something more. You'd need to turn it into a word that is less offensive than it is now, regardless of who uses it. So that it, as I say, on a par with cock. And I think that makes it more difficult as well. In part because if we say let's everybody use this word more often, then that's just going to be a sort of invitation for lots of unpleasant people to say, yeah, I can verbally abuse women, and it will look like I'm doing something wholesome. Right? So I think there are, there's similarities. Sort of cunt is slur-like, but there's differences too, and those differences potentially cause a problem when we're thinking about sort of how to reduce its offensiveness.
Yeah, I found that discussion in the book very illuminating. And one thing that you talk about, at least in the context of swearing, is the use mention distinction and how that might play out in using swears in the news, for instance. I mean, maybe you can say what that distinction is and then talk about that with respect to swears. But I'm also wondering, does something like that apply with respect to slurs too? And would that change the offensiveness conditions in a way that's different from swears, or is there a parallel between the two there?
Yeah, so the use mention distinction. So we use the words that I'm uttering to you now, I'm using. But if I wanted to refer to one of those words, then I'd be mentioning it. So if I say, let's have a discussion about the word book, shall we? Then I've mentioned that word. So often when words are mentioned in writing, they've got inverted commas around them. It's not quite the same thing, sort of quoted versus unquoted words, but that's a way to think about them. And that this often fits with sort of how swearing appears in the news, that it's often among the publications that are willing to write out the words in full. So the Guardian, for example, the policy is, well, if somebody said a swear word and we want to report what they've said, then we write it out in full. But we don't just kind of, like litter the rest of the newspaper with swear words just in the course of reporting stories. The thought there is that it's excusable and inoffensive to mention swear words in some cases where it would be unacceptable or offensive to use them. With slurs, I think is a little bit more difficult. So there are lots of people that think that it's fine to mention slurs as long as you don't use them. But nevertheless, there are plenty of cases where, and these stories pop up in the news from time to time, where, for example, I give an example in the book, a white professor giving a lecture and reading out something that has the N-word in it and uttering that word. And the students didn't like it. I think, there was sort of some message of disapproval from the institution as well. one way of looking at that is to say, well, what's the problem? He just mentioned it. It's not like he's, using that word as an insult to one of his students. He's just reading a piece of text, so that there's a sort of scholarly purpose behind it. And I think what's muddying the waters here is that slur words can just cause, regardless of whether they're used or mentioned, they can cause people to be upset. Right, the reactions that members of the group targeted by the slur feel when they encounter a slur word don't necessarily distinguish between whether it's used or whether it's mentioned. So you might still take the view, well, that's their fault, right? But I confront this issue directly. I teach a philosophy of language course, and there's a week when we do slurs, and I've taken the approach that I'm not going to utter any slur word that is aimed at a target group that I don't belong to, simply because it just seems kind of inconsiderate and disrespectful for me to say, well, if you're upset by it, that's your problem, when this is not a problem that I encounter myself. I think it would be different if I was sort of a member of the target group. So I think this goes back to this the question that you asked before, like sort of how, if we can't make sense of why people are offended, should we care about it? And I think in this case, as I've said, there is this argument that some people have made that, well, if it's just mentioned, you can say what you like. I think it's more complicated than that. I think sort of people have very good reasons why they might be offended, and even if there is a benign story that you can tell.
So I'm curious about how far your condemnation of wrongful cases goes. So cases in which it is clear that offense is being caused, it is clear that the offense is legitimate, whether it be from a slur or a swear word. You might want to say, on the one hand, that the speaker has done something immoral when he's spoken in that way. But you might want to go further and say that that word in that context was so bad that it's illegal. It should be banned or criminally sanctioned. How far should we go when punishing wrongful use of these words?
I think the idea that swearing should be illegal has less intuitive plausibility to it than the same with slurs. I think if we had a slur word and it, there was a thought that, or people were questioning, should it actually be illegal to utter this word? I mean, I suppose the sort of scenario that I could imagine that there being a case for that is if you have this background of oppression against members of a certain group where it's sort of out of hand, people are sort of being persecuted to an extreme level, and then you might think, well, there might be a case there for making certain behaviors to do with persecution of that group illegal, and uttering slurs might be part of that. But yeah, I mean, this then is linked with, you're sort of viewing slurs as a tool of oppression then, and then it's oppression that is the morally concerning thing rather than just the utterance of a word. But then I think that's quite right. I think, when we sort of zoom in on the words and say and ask things like, should it be illegal to utter this word, or is it wrong to utter this word? I mean, sort of viewing it very artificially as, sort of as if you do something wrong merely by uttering a certain sounds in a certain series of sounds in a certain order, or writing letters in a certain order. I mean, that gives a very artificial view of what the wrong is, right? Because it's not just about the word, it's about the sort of the place of the word in, patterns of behavior in our culture more generally.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that swearing in certain contexts was illegal in Arizona, which is my home state, and I was not aware of that.
Be very careful.
Yeah, no, when I go back now, I'm going to just be very good.
Yeah, button up your shirt.
Yeah, right. So one thing that's so interesting, I think about, at least many swear words is how versatile they are. So you mentioned sentence this. I think it's this fucking fucker is fucking fucked, and that's grammatically correct. We can make sense of it. Another one that I came across was you can put fuck or fucking pretty much fucking anywhere in a fucking sentence and fucking still be grammatically fucking correct. So can you talk a little bit about how versatile these swear words are and how they might be different from non swear words that we use in everyday context?
Yes, there's been philosophers haven't written very much about swear words, but there's some fascinating stuff by linguists out there. I can't remember who wrote what I'm going to talk about, so the practice of inserting a swear word into the middle of a word, like if you were to say, "I'm from Arizona." There's rules about sort of where that needs to go. That it sort of can go sort of. It's something like you have to put it before the stressed syllable or something like that. So you couldn't say, "I'm from Arizona fucking nah." Linguists have written some sort of really amazing stuff along these lines, but I mean, what I just said there, you couldn't, you have to put it here. You can't put it there. This says a sort of, well, what are the rules? Where do these rules come from? And, because there is, as you say, swear words are sort of super versatile. You can just sort of throw them into sentences in a way that you couldn't, if you just take fucking to be a verb, you can throw it in sentences in places that you would never put a different verb, right? And this too has been written about. James Macaulay, the late linguist, wrote about this. I think in part that's to do with just because we understand that when we use swear words, we are not necessarily using them in a sort of, fucking isn't always a verb straightforwardly. Sometimes we just use it as a sort of to like a seasoning to what else we're saying, or a sort of punctuation, or just a sort of more like a scream than a word, to sort of paraphrase Jeffrey Nunberg. So I think part of the versatility has to do with just the way that we understand swear words are used, which is kind of circular. But yeah, we sort of understand that they're sort of words, but they're also sort of not quite words. On the other side of that, sort of what are the limits to that? So yeah, as I said, that there's been views expressed about, you can do this with them, you can't do that. You can insert a swear word into a longer word in this particular place, but not in this other place. And you can, I think I'm thinking of Steven Pinker again now, where he's talking about sort of whether comparing the word fucking to different sorts of words. And he said it can't be an adjective, because there's certain things you could do with adjectives, but we can't do them with swear words. So you can't say, you might say something like, "How good was that?" Very. But you couldn't say, "How good was that?" Fucking. Even though you might, you would also say sort of, "That was fucking good," or "That was very good." But yeah, just sort of reading through observations like this and thinking, well, you're describing how swear words tend to be used, but I'm not sure whether you can get anything really normative out of that. Whether you can sort of jump from people don't tend to say, "How good was that fucking," from there to, well, you can't, there's a rule against doing it. I think it is kind of an anarchic region of language, in that we're not taught how to do it. You might be taught as a child how to, things like sort of subject verb agreement, and how to make words into plurals, this sort of thing. But we're not taught how to swear. We just sort of pick it up from, older children, naughty people. We're not sat down with our parents and taught how to swear. So there is this sort of, well, where do these words come from then? Nobody ever told me. And I think that although there's times when we might think somebody swore incorrectly, I'm not sure there's an obvious distinction between the sort of swearing that we might regard as incorrect and the sort that we might just regard as creative. You know, if you take, I don't know if you're aware of the character Malcolm Tucker from the British political satire called The Thick of It, where he would just sort of come out with these really creative ways of swearing and insulting people. And you can look, you know, there's lots of BuzzFeed articles about, you know, sort of here are Malcolm Tucker's best lines, stuff like this. And he's often using swear words in a way that is unusual. But you know, there's nobody saying he's, you know, he doesn't know how to swear properly. And I think probably what's going on there is that there's no doubt that he knows how to speak English, and he's swearing in English. And so people think, okay, he's just kind of being a bit creative, making stuff up. I think some of the things that some of the sweary expressions he's used were said by somebody who is clearly a learner of the language. Then maybe people's reactions might be a bit different. Maybe people might say, oh, they haven't quite grasped how to use this particular swear word. All of which is to say, I don't really think there are rules about how to swear. You know, I don't think there's. I think we can describe how people swear, but I think we're in sort of muddy water immediately if we start talking about you can't say this with a swear word. I think if you're an otherwise fluent speaker of the language, then if you start using swear words in an unusual way, people are going to sort of view you as just a creative swearer, which is, you know, that's sort of it's a bit unfair to language learners, right? If they then get judged more harshly. But I think that's probably the lay of the land here.
I'm not sure if you're aware of one of my favorite instances of insertion of swearing, specifically the word fucking. There's a fantastic book called Fucking Frankenstein. And it was written by, I think, Matt Allen. And it's an ode to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And basically, it's the same book. It's identical, except the word fucking is inserted into every sentence at least once, at various points in every sentence. And I just think it's a it's a great instance of what you're talking about. Um, I have one more question, which is years ago I came across a study which said that people who swear are more likely to be intelligent or have a higher IQ than people who don't. Um, and I wondered whether that data has any veracity or whether you've seen anything similar in the data.
Yes, it's this sort of perennial argument, isn't it? I suppose the reaction, you know, so there's this view that people who swear are less intelligent. You know, they swear because they can't think of better words. And then you get studies like the one you've mentioned. I think there is some disagreement about whether it actually shows what people take it to show. I think what they actually did was just sort of get people to think of as many swear words as they could, and took this as a sign of, you know, sort of how fluent they were. There's something along these lines. I'd be surprised if there were any, you know, really clear correlation between intelligence and swearing in general. Partly because there's just so many there's so many different ways that people swear. And there's types of swearing that we might call kind of more kind of creative and intelligent. I mean, sort of an example might be the way that sort of Malcolm Tucker type swearing, where, you know, it's kind of really inventive, and you can imagine him sort of creating, you know, sort of creating imaginative insults even without swear words. You know, it's almost an art form. And then there are ways that people swear where they're sort of just throwing swear words fairly thoughtlessly into sentences, sort of almost like the way we would say or like somebody who would constantly say like in their sentences, which I'm probably going to notice myself doing from now on. But, you know, sort of these two approaches to swearing are kind of quite different, right? Sort of one is sort of quite creative and almost an art form. The other is just sort of fairly thoughtless. So, you know, the idea that we can, you know, if we're asking, are people who swear more intelligent than people don't swear? I mean, you're incorporating so many different approaches to swearing that I'd be surprised if there were any sort of worthwhile observation to come out of that. I suppose one observation to make is that especially when people talk about swearing as being a mark of a lack of intelligence, I wonder whether there's sort of class issue going on here. I wonder if, sort of when people hear someone like Stephen Fry swear, and I think, oh, he's so clever and naughty, but then he's quite sort of posh. Whereas if they were to hear somebody, who's sort of clearly like working class, say the same sorts of things, that maybe they would be judged differently. So I think, again, it might just be these judgments about how intelligent swearers are might be sort of piggybacking on other assumptions that we make about people rather than any, sort of substantial link between swearing and IQ.
Yeah. So my last question is, would the world be better if we revised our language to not have swear words? Or is there something valuable about being able to offend?
So there's one question about whether that would even be possible. If you view swearing as a form of taboo, cultures all around the world have taboos, which, given that it wasn't that one culture got the idea and everybody copied, I mean, it seems to reflect something. I mean, if we take that to reflect a sort of universal trait in humans and their cultures, then, maybe we kind of need the taboos for some, or maybe they're in some sense inevitable, which would speak to sort of swearing. It'd be quite difficult to get rid of swearing. But sure, I think there's fantastic benefits to swearing that tend to be overlooked. This has been written about a little bit. So there is the idea that swearing is, we're aware that we swear when we're in pain, for example, or when we're annoyed, or in emotionally charged situations. And so there's this idea that swearing can be an important pressure valve, that it can vent emotions that might otherwise come out in less benign ways. So there's a series of experiments by the psychologist Richard Stevens, where he, a sort of famous series of experiments where he demonstrated that if people are asked to hold a hand in a bucket of icy water for as long as they can keep their hand there for longer if they're allowed to utter swear words than if they're allowed to utter words that aren't swear words or remain silent, which was taken to as evidence that swearing helps people cope with pain. There's also a theory that, so this is something that's written by someone called Emma Byrne, who wrote a book called Swearing is Good for You, where she talks about how if we weren't able to vent things like aggression and anger by swearing, we might resort to physical violence. So, it's better to kind of have a sweary screaming match with somebody if the alternative is that you're going to punch them. So it's kind of like a low cost form of aggression. So you might see, that as a benefit as well. You might not like swearing, but maybe you'd like what would replace it even less. And then there's also, the end of the question was, is there value to offending people? And this is something that I got to thinking about when I was writing the book, and I talk about at the end of the book. I came across a blog post by a disabled blogger called Mel Baggs, who's sadly passed away now. But they used voice software to communicate with people, and so I think they used a wheelchair as well, and they would sort of type things onto a pad, and a machine would utter the words. And they wrote a blog post about the importance of basically being able to tell people to back off, following on from an earlier blog post where they sort of talked about sort of disabled people in general suffering from people sort of really invading their space. And so they decided that they would make a page on their voice machine dedicated to saying things that were designed to get people to take a step back, get out of their face, whatever. And the expressions ranged from quite mild, like, sort of, can you give me some space, to fuck off. Sort of with a spectrum of expressions with different degrees of force. And they talked about how when they tried to use the term, the sweary expression, nobody would take them seriously. That people would just laugh, like, "Oh God, this person's cursing you using a machine." And they wrote, this was actually really frustrating. That wasn't the effect that they were going for at all. And I think, when we talk about the norms around swearing and its capacity to offend, most of the time what we focus on is the importance of avoiding offending people, if that is something that we ought to be doing. We don't think of the other side, which is that what if you can't? Like, what if you don't have that ability? Sort of worrying about whether we offend people with swearing presupposes that we have that ability, whereas some people don't. So Mel Baggs's blog posts or series of blog posts just raised the idea that people with disabilities, if this is a sort of general phenomenon that people with disabilities might have trouble causing offence with swearing, that might cause certain problems for them. And I think there's other groups too. When very young children swear, we don't take them seriously. If you're a parent, you might take it very seriously. But if a toddler said to you "fuck you," and you reacted to them as if an adult had said that to you, then people would sort of think like you're overreacting a bit. It's just a little toddler. But I think maybe other people as well, sort of maybe people who sort of look a bit unusual, who have an unusual voice or unusual accent. These, that we can imagine sort of various groups of people who might have trouble causing offence when they swear. And I think this is actually really worrying, because I think what's going on is people in certain groups struggle to cause offence by swearing because the people they're speaking to, or the people that they are trying to offend, don't recognise them as part of the group of people who can offend them. It's sort of, you're not one of us. Which is a really worrying attitude, right? If somebody with a disability is swearing at you, then you ought to be recognising them as part of the group of people who can offend you with swearing. I mean, maybe not so much with toddlers, right? Because you think, well, look, they kind of maybe don't really understand what they're saying, or they've heard mummy say this when she's driving, and they're just repeating it the way they repeat other things. But someone with a disability who you've got no reason to think doesn't know what they're saying, there's something very worrying going on there. And so I think our patterns of what we're offended by, who is capable of causing offence to us by swearing, can reveal prejudice. Right, because if we're the sort of person who's liable to be offended by swearing in a polite context, then that attitude really ought to be applying to all adults, or sort of all adult speakers of our, sort of competent speakers of the language that we're using, say. And I think if that's not the case, then that's a bit of a red flag. That's possibly something that's signalling prejudice. It shouldn't be there.
That's fascinating, that the ability to swear and cause offense assumes that you have some level of dignity, and that if you can't cause offense, then maybe that there's some sort of assumption that your dignity is undermined. There's a Canadian comedian, Nikki Payne, who has a lisp, and she trades on exactly this. So she constantly swears throughout the performance, using syllabic sounds, using S's, and she uses her lisp to. People will laugh at that, and then they will feel uncomfortable about laughing at that, but she'll double down on it so that it's even funnier. But the fact that her lisp is conveying comedy rather than offense with the use of the swear word is what her comedy is about, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, that I hadn't heard of her. That's fascinating. That's kind of actually a really powerful way of demonstrating that problem.
Yeah,
too.
I don't know how much of it's intentional and how much not. I think it is intentional. I think she's very smart. I find her very funny. Yeah, comedy and dignity through swearing is a very interesting interchange and mix. It's a very interesting cocktail. Thank you so much for being on the show, Rebecca. It was a fucking fascinating discussion, is what what I want to say.
Thanks for fucking having me. This has been really good fun. Can I point out before I go that I'm wearing I'm wearing earrings that my sister had made for me, which are little versions of the cover of my book. She's been giving me a hard time for not wearing them.
Amazing. Okay, amazing. That's fucking amazing. Yeah.